Tenim amb nosaltres amb el professor Jean-Claude Monod. Jean-Claude Monod és investigador del Centre Nacional de la Recerca Científica a París i després és professor a l'École Normale Supérieure, també de París, encarregat del màster de Filosofia contemporània. I, bueno, entre les seves obres principals, que afortunadament aviat estaran traduïdes, estaran publicades, el seu text gros, que forma part de la seva tesi doctoral, que és la querella de la disputa de la secularització, que serà publicat en castellà, i després un llibre més breu, però també prou interessant, que és Secularització i laïcitat, estarà publicat en català i en castellà a Proteus. I bé, el darrer llibre d'ell, que és aquest que acaba de sortir, que encara ha sortit al setembre, em sembla, setembre, no? Que és un jefe, un cap en democràcia, que és sobre el tema del carisma, el subtítol és Polítiques del carisma, i que forma part també d'aquesta reflexió que ell fa i que avui ens ve aquí a oferir, molt agraïts que estiguis aquí, i en fi, endavant. Gràcies.
Muchas gracias y discúlpame, no habla en anglais, finalement, en anglais. So in their book, Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? What is philosophy? Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari have defined philosophy, or the task of philosophy, as creation of concepts. The concept of secularization as a category of interpretation of modern history is sometimes attributed to philosophy of history and seen as the creation of one of the most famous philosophy of history, Hegel's philosophy of history. But Hegel used the term Verweltlichung, let's say wordization, so to say, and his interpretation of modernity had an important theological background. The Geist, the spirit, becoming finite through his kind of passion throughout history. A more scientific or neutral use of secularization is usually referred to historical sociology, or sociology of religions, or sociology of modernity, especially to Max Weber and Ernst Troeltsch's works. So the question I would like to deal with today is not a genealogy of the concept of secularization, but another one. What should we expect from an historical and sociological concept, and from this concept in particular, and what should we not expect? The concept of secularization is supposed to help us to think history, but maybe, should we precise very soon, Western history, at least, mainly European history, and more precisely, Western modern history, and the present. And here we can ask ourselves, does it help or not in this task? Can we really do without a concept of secularization when we approach Western modern history in the present? Or, as Carl Schmitt said, without a concept of secularization, no understanding of the last centuries of our history is ever possible. Without a concept of secularization, no understanding of the last centuries of our history is ever possible. Why do we need the concept of secularization according to Carl Schmitt in this text, that is Political Theology, the preliminary remark to the second edition of the Political Theology? Why do we need this concept according to Schmitt? And Schmitt refers here on that point to, and in other texts, to Auguste Comte and to Max Weber. I think from the use he makes of this concept, one can assume that the concept of secularization is necessary in order to three main goals, so to say. First, it is necessary to understand what makes our present time different from what Europe was a few centuries ago, in the organization of power, as well as in the dominant ideas, in the elites. So it's the first point, to understand what makes our present different. It's also necessary to identify a process which has transformed our societies and maybe continues to transform our society, which is still going on. And last, it's necessary in order to study, to question the origins of a certain number of concepts, representations, schemas, institutions. And concerning Carl Schmitt, in fact, at least in political theology, that's even the main point, to study the origins of a certain number of political and theoretical concepts. So as the concept of secularization lost its relevance or failed in these three directions. As we know, the relevance of the concept of secularization has been much challenged and questioned in the last decades as a sociological concept in its relationship with the contemporary evolutions of the world today, but also in philosophy. So I would like in this communication to study a few discussions about the relevance of this concept in sociology and in philosophy, and I will only, in the second part of this paper, evoke one of these sets of criticism, so to say, which came from various representatives of the deconstruction movement. So first, the idea that the concept or the paradigm of secularization has lost any relevance, or at least a large part of its relevance has been developed since, I think, the 70s of the last centuries, or the end of the 60s. And it sometimes took the form of a sharp self-criticism or repudiation among some famous sociologists. A famous case is that of Peter Berger, who had built a general theory of modernity as secularization in the 50s, and who wrote in 74 these lines, these famous lines: many observers of the religious scene, I among them, have overestimated both the degree and irreversibility of secularization. Many observers have, and Peter Berger say, I'm among them, have overestimated both the degree and irreversibility of secularization. And here, Peter Berger was not challenging the very concept of secularization, but two aspects, two characters which were attributed to it by the paradigm of secularization: its high degree in modernity and its irreversibility. But at the end of the 20th century, Berger has hardened, so to say, what has been sometimes ironically pointed out as his recantation, with his diagnosis of desecularization of the world. And then he wrote, I quote, "The big mistake which I shared with everyone who worked in this area in the 50s and 60s was to believe that modernity necessarily leads to a decline of religion." So the big mistake which I shared with everyone who worked in this area in the 50s and 60s was to believe that modernity necessarily leads to a decline of religion. So we see that after the problem of its degree and of its irreversibility, two or three new critical elements are added: the so-called necessity of secularization its identification with modernity and its definition as decline of religion. So the first expectation linked with the concept of secularization was, as I said before, that it helps us, it might help us to think what makes the present different from the past under the perspective of the place of religions in this world. And that's precisely, according to the late Peter Berger, what it does not anymore. I quote Berger's most famous declaration in that sense: "The assumption that we live in a secularized world is false. The world today," he adds, "with some exceptions, to which I will come presently, is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever." So it was on this, in this book about the desecularization of the word. So I'll come back later to the exception admitted by Berger, and this exception proves to be us, so to say. Because reading Berger, we have to consider ourselves as belonging to a both geographical and social exception. The one setting where secularization is entrenched is, among, I quote Berger, an international subculture composed of people with Western type higher education, especially in the humanities and social sciences. So it's kind of, I think, people in this room, an international subculture composed of people with Western type higher education, especially in the humanities and social science. To this type, to this group, okay, secularization seems to be something very obvious, but it's an exception. We are an exception. So we see that the second dimension that I've mentioned earlier is requiring the concept of secularization would equally be dismissed. According to Peter Berger, the late Peter Berger, secularization does not correspond to a process which would presently take place in the contemporary world. The main process, the main tendency would be, on the contrary, a process of desecularization, which can take different forms. Peter Berger has offered the following as reasons to explain is passing from the secularization thesis to the desecularization thesis. First point, it was the growth of conservative and evangelical churches in the US, and we could add today the spectacular growth of neo-evangelism and Pentecostalism in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia. Second point, the decline of the liberal churches. Third point, the persistence of interest in religion in other Western societies, even the most secularized one. Four, the vitality of religion in other parts of the world, and especially of Islam, and of a form of Islam which dismisses the liberal separations and secularizations, or neutralizations, as Carl Schmitt said, Salafism, fundamentalism, Islamism. One should add to this list the collapse of a major secularist ideology and political system, the Soviet communism, and the rebirth of the churches and religions in all the former Soviet republics. And being the French speaker of this conference, I could add a very recent and significant phenomenon, in as much as France is supposed to be one of the most secularized lands. Our previous president, Nicolas Sarkozy, attempted to transform, let's say, the spirit of laïcité in what he called a laïcité positive toward religions and what they are supposed to bring to a society. So until then, laïcité was supposed to be neutral toward religion or non-religious beliefs, and not positive nor negative. So what about the third dimension I've evoked while commenting Carl Schmitt's statement, the, let's say, genealogical use of secularization? Here we meet what has been called the structural and semantic ambiguity or ambivalence of the category of secularization. Indeed, in its use in philosophy, history, sociology, and so on, secularization proves to have at least two distinct and potentially opposite meanings. When Berger says that he was wrong to believe that modernity necessarily leads to a decline of religion, he relies on one of these two meanings, that is, and there has been this definition this morning, secularization as a decline of religion, or what I've proposed to call secularization liquidation, kind of. And that's also sometimes in that sense that Carl Schmitt approaches the decline of theology in the speeches and arguments held by the European elites between the 16th century and the 20th century, what Carl Schmitt calls the center of the debates, the dominant era, has shifted from theology to a philosophy of natural rights during the 18th century, to law, morals, and at the 19th century and 20th century it has shifted toward economy as the Zentralgebiet, the central domain, with the idea that if you solve the problems in this area, you will solve all the problems, in a way. It's the idea when the elites of the 16th century had so much disputes about and quarrels about theology. It's because it was the essential domain and everything would depend on it. And with the new elites in the 20th century, it's the same, but with economy. So economy becomes the stake of the major conflicts, with the conflicts, for instance, between liberalism and communism, as theology was at the 16th and 17th, with the division of Christianity, Reformation, and religious European civil war. Nevertheless, we find in Schmitt's writings, as in Max Weber's, another meaning for Säkularisierung. It is the transformation of a theological, religious concept, content, form of or institution into a secular institution, form, and so on. So I've proposed to call that the secularization transfer, kind of, not the secularization liquidation, but the secularization transfer, the transformation of a content into another. So perhaps the most famous expression of this view of secularization is Carl Schmitt's theorem, so to say. All the concepts of the modern state theory are secularized theological concepts, sovereignty, and so on. And it's also in that sense that Max Weber talked about the importance of the various associations and clubs in the American social life at the beginning of the 20th century as being the result of a Säkularisierungsprozess, a process of secularization of the religious sects and of their function of social probing and cooptation and so on. I recall that because I think it already gives a more complex and subtle image of the secularization thesis and paradigms. So here, religion does not disappear. It continues to inform and to infuse modern secular forms of institution or thought. And of course, that's important concerning the relationships between philosophy and secularization, modern philosophy and religion. If many philosophers from the Enlightenment have criticized the hegemonical position of religion, they have not, most of the time, considered that philosophy had nothing to do anymore with the content of religion, with its ethical but also symbolical content. So they have given, in many times, I will give maybe examples of that later. They have given a philosophical translation of symbols, insights, or religious representations. But this precision doesn't change much to the most controversial point, as the idea of an irreversible and linear and necessary process of decline of the original form of religion. And the original form, of course, it's difficult to define an original form of religion, a true religion, so to say. But let's define that original form as, let's say, a faith in a supernatural being and a practice of rituals or sacraments. And this has declined, and at the moment, declined due to the very dynamics of modern development in the political, social, or economic fields. That was the thesis, and such a thesis, I think, might be found in some of the sources of the sociology of religion and of the paradigms of secularization, in Auguste Comte's writings, with this idea of a succession of steps in humanity, the mythological step, the theological step, and the positive state, l'état positif, even if, in fact, the overcoming of the theological by the positive state did not mean to count the disappearing of religion, but was preparing the advent of a new religion, a religion of humanity itself. But I let this aspect aside. In the Discours de l'esprit positif, one finds the idea of a correlation, indeed, between, on the one hand, the industrial intervention in nature, so the growth of the rise of the technical mastering of natural phenomena, and on the other hand, the decline of the mythological as well as of the theological explanations and approaches of the natural processes and events. I quote and translate, "The industrial life is directly contrary to any providential optimism, as it supposes that natural order is imperfect enough to claim constantly human intervention. The same fundamental correlation," adds Comte, "which makes the individual life so favorable to positive spirit, yes, this correlation has an anti-theological tendency. So, in apparently the same way, Max Weber has developed the idea of a link between the disenchantment of the world and the fact that we live in the modern world surrounded by objects and machines which have been made by other men. And he suggested that it's a very different situation from that of the ancient and sometimes contemporary peoples who were mostly agrarian people whose existence depended on forces, the rain, the sun, and so on, that they could not master and which were beyond any possibility of human action or influence, except precisely the magic action and the influence of the magicians, masters of rain, and through gifts, prayers, and so on. So one of the correlations that Max Weber had noted was the relative decline of a magical view of the world linked with the rise of technological and scientific rationalism. But I would like to lay stress upon the fact that this process of demagification or disenchantment, famous Entzauberung der Welt, is not to be confused with the idea of a decline of religion, according to Weber. It is the decline of magic is not the same thing as the decline of religion as such. Even if Max Weber's terminology is not absolutely fixed, one can and what should not, I think, that those two concepts refer in Weber to distinct processes. The Entzauberung der Welt, disenchantment of the world, refers to a very long-term process which originates, according to Weber, in the opposition of ancient Judaism and of the prophecies of the Ancient Testament toward magic as a mean of salvation. This rejection of magic has been supported later by the rationalism of the Greek science and by the industrial technique through which nature is increasingly dominated. And this has, according to Weber, its outcome in the ethical rationalism of modern Protestantism and Puritanism, where all the elements of magic, which could or what could appear in Christianism and in Catholicism as a kind of remnants of magic instruments or mediations, are violently rejected. But precisely, if Weber says that here, in this form of extreme ascetic religiosity, disenchantment of the world has been accomplished, that shows clearly that we cannot confuse Entzauberung der Welt and secularization in the sense of decline of religion. People can be, and I think it's largely the case in the Western world today, but not only, people can be at the same time religious and disenchanted. And I think that the interest of this distinction is precisely to allow us to think the coexistence of a technical and scientific universe highly developed and a high religiosity on the other hand, as in the US today, or the coexistence of a capitalist industrial economy and a system of law almost completely determined by religion, as in the Muslim Emirates, for instance. So what has lost any relevance here is not any idea of secularization, I think, but it's what Charles Taylor, in the book that was cited this morning, calls the substractive theory of secularization, according to which the more a society becomes modern in economical and or technological terms, the less it becomes religion. This kind of simple relationship is, of course, challenged, but not any idea of secularization. I think any evolutionist and linear theory of secularization should be avoided, but it does not concern so much Weber's sociology than the paradigm of secularization as modernization, which has been built later, especially in the American sociology. And I think that Peter Berger has passed from a too linear, too universalistic, and too evolutionist view of secularization to an excessive rejection of the concept. So it's true that the current world is crossed by a tendency which opposes itself to secularization, let's say a reassertion of religion in the public sphere, a deprivatization of religion, sometimes a politicization, and so on. But I think that secularization should be seen as an essential framework of our thought and moral activity, so essential that we often don't notice it anymore. The scientific and modern philosophical culture is not just the framework in which Western elites live. It has a global diffusion, and it has redefined the norms of truth, of knowledge, but also of moral life, I think, worldwide. It's true that they are often criticized and challenged, but precisely the world today is a field of forces, and I think the secularist forces, in the various forms they take, are among these forces. There are everywhere also secularist forces and anti-secularist forces. So we can say also that under certain aspects, the process of secularization continues, goes on. It goes on particularly with the refoundation of the moral and sexual customs and life, and of the laws concerning sexuality and marriage. Of course, it was discussed this morning. But marriage has become, since the 18th century, I think, more seen as a contract between two equal wills, a contract that can be broken with divorce and so on. And homosexuality, often quite recently and not everywhere, ceased to be condemned as an offense. And I think it's impressive, we discussed that at length, that one of the most Catholic European lands, Portugal, has legalized gay marriage. And of course, we saw here the forces struggling against it, also the secularization as a field of forces struggling, the ones against the others. So I wonder if the fact of saying that secularization is over, secularization is dead, secularization is a past thing, is not sometimes a kind of wishful thinking, a way to exercise secularization, and to an exercising gesture against the continuing process of secularization, especially in matter of norms of morality and sexuality. So that was very quickly this debates about the concept of secularization and its relevance today from some sociological points of view. And I would like to come to a more philosophical discussion now. That is the one which comes from the deconstruction field. I think that the motto of deconstruction of Christianism is less the name of a definite and, let's say, a pacified program than the name of a discussion, of an attempt. What kind of attempt? An attempt to avoid a certain style of description of religion in modern age, and an attempt to give a new image of this, maybe a new understanding of some fundamental religious thoughts and experiences. It's a little long. So I refer it, in fact, to three thinkers, but I won't have the time to develop these three perspectives, which are in part common, but in part different, the one from the others, that are the criticism toward the secularization idea developed by Heidegger, by Jean-Luc Nancy, and by Derrida. It's too much, so I will have only kind of a spot. I think a common point between Heidegger, Nancy, and Derrida concerning religious matters is their rejection of some alternatives and categories through which it is suggested that religion is simply an irrational and primitive thinking. The assimilation of religion to irrational or primitive thinking. Jean-Luc Nancy calls that primitivism, and he suggests that as the ethnography of the 19th century describes the so-called primitive people, non-Western people, primitive people through a mere negative contrast as pre-scientific, pre-rational, pre-logical, without state, and so on, only negative characterizations. The evolutionist approach of religion and secularization used to conceive religion as an essentially past phenomenon, archaic, doomed to slowly disappear, or at least to decline with the progress of enlightenment, science, reason, and industry. And in a way, Auguste Comte could, in a way, be an illustration of that. Hence, in this view, the surprise in front of the so-called return of the religious. And Nancy proposes another description and other concepts than this view of what I've called the secularization liquidation, Nancy's own description articulates, in a way, two radical assertions, affirmations. First, it is that indeed Christianism is over. Christianism is over. In what sense? In that it is over as Christianity, as a space dominated by a living and leading religion. And in a way, indeed, we live in a more secular world than ever, at the peak maybe of a process of what Nancy calls déclosion. Déclosion, it's quite difficult to translate because in fact it doesn't exist in French either. So only in ancient French have we the term déclore, which means to take off the edges. You know, there is a closures, and when you take the closures, it's the act of déclore. So there is the idea that everything is open, that what was closed is opened and is empty in a way. But it's the second axiom or thesis developed by Nancy is that this extinction of Christianism as Christianity is also the result of Christianism itself, of its own self-deconstruction. So here the question becomes how to think our relationship to Christianism as something which is at the same time, so to say, past, over, and something that continues to be present in a way in our lives. À quoi, I quote in French Nancy, jusqu'à quel point tenons-nous au christianisme? To what extent do we care for Christianism? Do we care about Christianism? And comment exactement, dans toute notre tradition, sommes-nous tenus par lui? There is a play on the words of because jusqu'à quel point tenons-nous au christianisme? Comment exactement, dans toute notre tradition, sommes-nous tenus par lui? How precisely, in our old tradition, are we all back by him? Are we held? Oh, I don't know. So I think it's another formulation, in a way, of the question of the secularization as transfer. But Nancy thinks that the concept of secularization doesn't give a good account, so to say, of this work out with our Christian past, so to say, and with the possibility that philosophy has to translate, in a way, motives and Christian ideas in a new language, to déclore precisely, to take up some major figures, but at the same time to free them from this tradition. So the two things at the same time, to free them from the Christian tradition and to work them in a philosophical way. And the examples would be that of the idea of brotherhood, fraternité, or the very idea of faith, fides, that could be something that philosophy would have to work out without dismissing it as religious, Christian, and so on, but by translating it in a new conceptuality, so to say. I think we find something very, very near from that in Derrida's reflection, but with a more critical orientation toward religion, in fact. We find the same criticism against a simplistic system of oppositions and about the inability to grasp the very phenomenon of religion, not only in the past but in our present day, when we approach religion as irrational past, kind of thought of the past, so to say. I quote Derrida's text, Faith and Knowledge, the two sources of religion at the limits of simple reason. Foi et savoir, les deux sources de la religion aux limites de la simple raison, which is an inversion, of course, of Kant's title, in the collective volume with Gianni Vattimo, La Religion. So I quote Derrida, why is this phenomenon, hastily baptized return of religions, so difficult to think? Why seems it so amazing? Why does it amaze, in particular, those who ingenuously believed that an alternative opposed on the one hand religion, on the other hand reason, enlightenment, science, critique, as if the one could but end with the other, comme si l'un ne pouvait qu'en finir avec l'autre. So we have here this criticism of the system of opposition through which reason and religion should have been defined during centuries. And this is really the same gesture as in the young Heideggers, but I won't comment on Heidegger today. The young Heidegger in his phenomenology of religious life, and in Derrida's, in the Nancy's text about deconstruction of Christianism. Some events of the end of the 20th century that I have evoked at the beginning have shaken these divisions and simplistic views of what is supposed to be compatible or incompatible, modern and not modern, and so on. These evolutions have also provoked the feeling of the loss of relevance of the concept of secularization. And here Derrida's critique of the concept repeats partly Heidegger's own deconstruction of the idea of Verweltlichung or Säkularisierung in his lessons about Nietzsche. Derrida also points out the fact that this concept rests on a Christian ecclesial and metaphysical opposition between the sacred and the regular, the sacred and the secular, between word and heaven, and so on. These oppositions are at the background of the concept of secularization, and they are, in a way, too Christian, according to Derrida. So the concept of secularization itself becomes too Christian, too marked by these Christian oppositions and concepts, so that it makes difficult its application beyond the European Christian or post-Christian area. And that's an idea that we find in different versions quite often today. We find it in a way in Talal Assad's idea that secularization is a Western concept and a Christian concept, so that it makes very difficult for an anthropologist to use it without great consciousness. But one could object that this supposes, this time, maybe a narrow and restrictive understanding of the idea of secularization and of the sociological uses of the concept of a process of secularization. if we understand this process as a loss of influence of religion in the diverse social spheres, in the public sphere, so that it does not imply all the precise oppositions and systems of secular and regular and so on, maybe we can consider that it's a more general and more universalist concept than what Derrida says. And if any evolutionist concept of secularization is over, once again, it does not mean that no process of secularization occurs today in any part of the world. Nevertheless, Derrida's apparent agreement with Heidegger and with Jean-Luc Nancy about the limits of the concept of secularization must not hide the fact that his own version of deconstruction is in a way much more secularist than the other ones. It's not only about the concept of secularization that Derrida says that it's too Christian, in a way. It's also about many motives of Heidegger's and Nancy's own philosophies and deconstructions. To harden the formulation of the device, one could say that Derrida wants to elaborate another deconstruction than the two Christian deconstructions carried out by Heidegger and Nancy. I just give one quote about this aspect of Derrida's deconstruction. I quote it in French and I will translate if you want. It was in an interview with the French magazine Le Monde de l'Éducation in 2000. So, ask about the meaning of deconstruction once more in this interview. Derrida answered this. Il faut rappeler les prémices nietzschéennes, freudiennes et surtout heideggeriennes de la déconstruction, et surtout, Derrida adds, au sujet de Heidegger, il faut rappeler qu'il y a une tradition chrétienne, plus précisément luthérienne, de ce que Heidegger appelle la destruction. Luther, je le rappelle, dit Derrida dans mon livre sur Jean-Luc Nancy et sur ce qu'il appelle, lui, la déconstruction du christianisme, Luther parlait déjà de destructio pour désigner la nécessité d'une désédimentation des strates théologiques qui dissimulaient la nudité originelle du message évangélique à restaurer. So we have to remember the Nietzschean, Freudian and above all Heideggerian premises of deconstruction. And particularly concerning Heidegger, we have to remember that there is a Christian tradition, and more precisely a Lutherian tradition of what Heidegger calls destruction. Luther, I remind it in my book about Jean-Luc Nancy and about what he calls the deconstruction of Christianism. Luther was already speaking about the destructio to point the necessity of a desedimentation of the theological strata that concealed the original nakedness of the evangelical message to be restored. Ce qui m'intéresse de plus en plus, Derrida conclude, ce qui m'intéresse de plus en plus, c'est de discerner la spécificité d'une déconstruction qui ne soit pas nécessairement réductible à cette tradition luthériano-heideggerienne. What interests me more and more is to distinguish the specificity of a deconstruction that would not necessarily be reducible to this Lutherian-Heideggerian tradition. Donc, so we see that Derrida wants to build a kind of deconstruction whose aim is not to restore the nudity of some theological concept. That was the idea of the young Heidegger, deconstruction of Christianism, nor, as Jean-Luc Nancy does, to give a new account of Christian concepts such as fraternité or piety or faith, but a more radical deconstruction, so to say, that would have no origin to restore, no origin to get back to. So as a conclusion, I apologize because it was very quick and maybe too many things in a short time, but I would like to come back to Deleuze's Qu'est-ce que la philosophie? In the introduction of the book, Deleuze quotes one of his favorite authors, Nietzsche, a fragment from spring 1885. So I quote Nietzsche, Deleuze quoting Nietzsche. Philosophers must no longer accept concepts as a gift. Philosophers must no longer accept concepts as a gift, nor merely try to purify and polish them, but first and foremost make and create them, present them and make them convincing. Hitherto, Nietzsche adds, one has generally trusted one's concepts as if they were a wonderful dowry from some sort of wonderland. And afterwards, Nietzsche defines here his own philosophy as an art of distrust opposed to the excess of piety towards the traditional concepts inherited from the past. Gift, wonderland, piety, certainly Nietzsche's attitude here could be seen as an expression of his, or a desire of a radical secularization, of a relationship to our intellectual tradition, radical secularization directed not only against religion, but against the piety that philosophers feel towards their own tradition. And this wheel of radicalization of secularization applied to new idols, science, a state, nation, and so on, is certainly a central dimension of the history of continental philosophy. This will to radicalize secularization and to turn it against philosophy itself, against all the remnants of theology and religion in itself. So maybe my critical defense of the concept of secularization originates in piety towards the sociological and philosophical tradition, and maybe I and we should try to invent and create some other concepts to deal with the transformation of religion in the contemporary world. But when I say maybe we should, it's not a rhetorical device, because I still think that the intrinsic richness and stratification of the concept of secularization make it difficult to overcome and maybe impossible to abandon. Thank you for your attention.
Si lo que se propone en español...
Sí, ok. Entiendo.
Si el problema es que el concepto de secularización puede ser aún considerado como demasiado cristiano para dar cuenta de lo que está pasando, pues el esfuerzo de la deconstrucción, tanto manciniana como tertulliana, conciben que realmente no es un término que deje de lado algo. Claro, entonces para poder dar cuenta de lo que está sucediendo, del desplazamiento de la religión por nuevos ídolos como son la ciencia o la iluminación, para dar cuenta de ellos, ¿qué término empleamos?
No lo sé. Es el problema que tengo. Fue la mi conclusión. Sí. No tengo una. No. Yeah, I think I'm not sure that we can accept Derrida's strategy, so to say, that consists in saying, well, it's Christian. En français, ça va en français? Oui, je ne pense pas qu'on peut accepter tout à fait la stratégie de Derrida qui consiste à dire que tel ou tel concept est trop chrétien. Déjà, c'est un peu étrange en soi, dire qu'un concept est trop chrétien. J'avais demandé un peu, moi, est-ce que donc il y a des concepts qui ne sont pas assez chrétiens? Bon, ça, c'est un peu une blague. Mais c'est vrai que, bon, pourquoi un concept est trop chrétien? Quels concepts ne sont pas trop chrétiens? Puisque tous, dans la perspective de la déconstruction heideggerienne, de l'ontothéologie, tous sont prêts, tous nos concepts sont passés par un certain filtre chrétien de la conceptualité chrétienne, même s'ils viennent de Grèce ou d'ailleurs, ils sont tous passés par ce filtre. Donc on ne peut pas se débarrasser en quelque sorte de ce... Alors la déconstruction, évidemment, ça consiste à remonter dans la tradition, à faire apparaître les différentes composantes, les briques, et ensuite, alors pour Heidegger, c'était quand même pour revenir aux sources mêmes de l'expérience grecque ou chrétienne selon les moments de l'œuvre de Heidegger, c'est-à-dire la déconstruction. Chez le jeune Heidegger, il dit ça peut nous montrer l'expérience authentique grecque ou chrétienne qui a été recouverte par le mélange des deux traditions. Donc là, on voit bien ce que signifie abbao, d'ailleurs, où vraiment on enlève les briques, et puis on remonte jusqu'aux sources cachées, qui ont été cachées par la transmission elle-même de cette expérience. Mais alors Derrida, il en fait un usage presque radicalisé, c'est-à-dire on déconstruit, mais ce n'est pas pour retourner à des sources qui elles-mêmes, on ne les trouve jamais. Donc, et puis moi je m'étais un peu amusé à voir que dans le texte où il écrit ça, Derrida, sur le fait que la sécularisation c'est un concept trop chrétien, il dit en revanche on pourrait approcher la situation présente comme une... reimmanentisation ou bien comme une forme de kénose. Donc c'est des concepts qui sont encore beaucoup très chrétiens eux aussi. Donc je pense que Derrida lui-même ne peut pas vraiment sortir de c'est impossible. C'est-à-dire on ne peut pas sauter par-dessus la tradition. On peut bien sûr avoir conscience du fait que séculier, régulier, sacré, profane, la règle et le siècle, ce sont des concepts assez particuliers à une tradition qui les a élaborés dans un contexte où il y avait une église ou qui pouvait se distinguer elle-même. Et c'est vrai que ce sont des concepts qui ont été élaborés au sein même de l'église. Bon, mais est-ce que ça les rend inutilisables? Pour autant, c'est la question. Mais c'est vrai qu'après, je pense là où Derrida pose une question un peu inévitable, qu'on ne peut que se poser, c'est de savoir si avec ces concepts-là, on va pouvoir approcher des aires géographiques, culturelles et religieuses très différentes, où la séparation du sacré et du profane, du séculier et du régulier n'a pas pris cette forme, où ces distinctions éventuellement n'existent pas, au moins sous cette forme. Donc est-ce que ça a un sens? Bon, c'est un problème classique aujourd'hui pour l'anthropologie des religions, mais est-ce que ça a un sens d'essayer de chercher de la sécularisation dans des sociétés... alors pour l'islam, ça se pose d'une certaine façon, mais il n'y a pas eu ce même partage, sous les mêmes lignes de partage entre le politique et le non-politique, entre le séculier et le régulier qui impliquait une vie des moines organisée selon certaines règles, etc. Tout ça n'existe pas dans toutes les sociétés. En Asie, on trouverait... Donc, est-ce que le concept de sécularisation est pertinent au-delà de la sphère chrétienne? Bon, ce problème, Derrida le retrouve d'une certaine façon à travers la généalogie du concept. Mais maintenant, je ne sais pas s'il peut vraiment proposer un autre vocabulaire qui serait débarrassé de cette hypothèque chrétienne. Alors que Nancy, en fait, accepte plutôt le cadre. Voilà. Et il dit, bon, simplement, le problème, c'est de savoir ce qui est, quand on dit sécularisation, même quand on dit sécularisation, transfert, de certaine façon, qu'est-ce qui est identique et qu'est-ce qui ne l'est pas? Qu'est-ce qui est l'identique, qui n'est pas identique? Enfin, toute cette question, qu'est-ce qui change? Bon. Et il dit que Blumenberg, je ne vais pas parler de Blumenberg, mais a bien vu le problème, au moins, de la sécularisation, même s'il n'a pas trouvé la bonne réponse.
Well, it is quite provocative the way you put it, because and it's uncomfortable also, because it is difficult to say something. But I'll answer also in a more or less provocative way.
Mm-hmm.
I know that the way you put things and it works. I
mean, no, but you can say that it doesn't work. No problem.
I would also agree. But if and I think that this comes from a desire more or less, of not being too colonial in a way.
In a way.
And I wonder what would be the political consequences of if we think right to the end this. And I guess that then Sarkozy would be right, being with a positive laïcité positive, in the sense that then you have to be open to all kinds of arguments in society, you know, because then it would be difficult to. I mean, if you cannot suppose that secularization is a good thing, because this is what we do, and you should be doing that, and it's time for you to start doing that, because we already did it, this is the civilization process, then you blur the differences between what we have been calling this morning political and religious reasons. So then you have to really be open to whatever comes. I mean, I know that what you said, it is not supposed to have political consequences. It is a more inner philosophical discourse. But if you think it that way, then you have some problems, maybe.
No, I think it has political consequences. But, I think you are right. Bon, je pense que ce travail un peu sur les concepts a forcément des conséquences philosophiques et peut-être même d'ailleurs des raisons, des conséquences politiques, pardon, et peut-être des motifs politiques même au départ. Moi, en un sens, j'ai commencé à travailler sur ces sujets, un peu d'ailleurs au moment justement où Derrida, etc., ont publié ces textes, c'est-à-dire sur le fond d'une certaine impression de... Bon voilà, il y avait ce qu'on appelait le retour des religions, il y avait eu la révolution islamique en Iran, il y avait les fondamentalismes, il y avait l'effondrement de l'URSS avec les nouvelles formes de religiosité. Voilà. Donc, un certain concept de sécularisation s'effondrait réellement à ce moment-là, d'un point de vue descriptif, sociologique, c'est-à-dire l'idée d'identifier l'histoire moderne à un processus de sécularisation inéluctable s'effondrait, disons, par là. Voilà. Parfois, c'est bien en sciences humaines, il y a quand même des moments où il y a une sorte de falsification au sens popperien de certains énoncés. C'est-à-dire l'idée que le cours qu'avait suivi l'Europe, disons, du XVIe au XXe siècle, allait s'universaliser d'une manière tranquille et voilà, était infirmé. Et je me souviens aussi, il y avait un auteur marxiste qui avait beaucoup travaillé sur le monde arabe et qui a dit, voilà, il pensait que les sociétés arabo-musulmanes allaient toutes suivre la voie de l'industrialisation égale la sécularisation, égale avancée vers des normes occidentales, et il se moquait de ces quelques étudiants qui s'intéressaient à des gens complètement bizarres comme les frères musulmans en Égypte. Ça lui semblait s'intéresser à des dinosaures. Et donc, sauf que cet étudiant, maintenant, bien sûr, c'est celui qu'on entend le plus en France, parce que il a travaillé sur l'origine d'un mouvement considérable. Donc, il y avait quelque chose de faux dans l'évolutionnisme, je crois. En tout cas, et ça, alors moi, j'ai un peu une tension politique sans doute, parce que c'est vrai que j'ai un père anthropologue, donc les anthropologues sont assez sensibles à une certaine relativité et au souci de ne pas exporter trop vite nos propres catégories, notre propre vision de l'histoire. L'idée que tous les peuples vont suivre ces étapes, etc., c'est quelque chose qui ne... Donc je pense qu'il faut essayer d'élaborer des concepts qui tiennent compte d'une certaine pluralité des devenirs historiques, sans pour autant, moi là je suis un peu normatif, mais je pense que je vais dans votre sens, sans pour autant renoncer à défendre certaines valeurs de sécularisation. Mais simplement en évitant de postuler que c'est un processus historique garanti par le développement des forces productives, de l'industrie, de la science, etc. Donc en arrêtant de se faire une idée simpliste de la sécularisation, du rapport religion-science, du rapport religion-technique, etc., comme ça a été quand même, je pense, le cas d'un certain nombre de savants, de sociologues et d'historiens du XXe siècle, qui ont considéré que voilà, c'était couru, il y avait ce développement de l'industrie, de la technique, etc. Donc déclin de la religion. Ben non, ça ne marche pas. Ça ne marche pas comme ça. D'autre part, ensuite, voilà, quelles formes de religiosité vont apparaître. En même temps, on voit qu'il y a évidemment des effets d'universalisation à travers le marché, à travers les médias mondiaux, etc., qui font que l'exigence démocratique, par exemple, elle se diffuse à travers ces médias, y compris dans des sociétés culturellement différentes et tout, avec les printemps arabes, etc. Donc je pense qu'il faut tenir ensemble des choses difficiles éventuellement à tenir ensemble, mais moi, c'est pas pour en conclure qu'il faut être ouvert à tous les arguments, y compris fondamentalistes, etc. C'est pour dire qu'il faut peut-être revoir le concept de sécularisation pour le rendre moins faible et moins perméable à une certaine critique qui a beau jeu de dire que c'est un concept qui passe à côté d'énormément d'évolutions contemporaines et qui est voilà. Bon, après, Sarkozy, c'est encore autre chose. C'est dans le champ français, les interprétations de la laïcité. Et moi, je défends tout à fait une laïcité stricte en France. Mais peut-être... Alors, après, est-ce qu'on peut dire je la défends universellement? Oui, ça, bon, ça, c'est vrai que j'ai peut-être un malaise à l'idée que je devrais défendre universellement la laïcité sur un mode univoque. Je pense qu'on peut la défendre en tenant compte malgré tout de contextes variés, peut-être d'accommodements raisonnables, etc. Mais bon, en France, il n'y a aucune raison de considérer qu'il faut changer de laïcité, à mon avis. Mais c'est vrai que l'idée que voilà, on a le modèle absolument parfait est toujours un peu problématique pour moi.